I'm Dustin Grinnell, and this is Curiously. When you discover your next-door neighbor is a real estate agent, a medium, and a psychic, with a doctorate in philosophy, and an all-around hilarious person, you'd be wise to become friends with them. And if you have a podcast, you should invite them on. So that's what I did. In this episode, I talk with Ellen Damsky, the most interesting person on our quiet street in the beachside community of Winthrop, Massachusetts. With such an eclectic background, I could have discussed any number of topics with Ellen, but I wanted to focus the conversation on her doctoral work about the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium, established in New York State in the late 1800s by the Dr. Livingston Trudeau. To write her dissertation, Ellen did years of fieldwork that include meetings with many former patients who had gone to the Adirondack Mountains to chase the cure at Trudeau Sanatorium. Despite these patients being ill, plagued by constant fatigue, separated from family and friends, and oftentimes bedridden for long periods of time, many of them told Ellen that they considered their stay at the Trudeau Sanatorium some of the best times of their lives. One former patient said, "Everyone should go to Saranac Lake to learn how to live." I wanted to understand why many patients felt this way and what it means for all of us. What lessons can be drawn from these patients' experiences, from Trudeau's story, from the sanatorium movement, from the fresh air cure. We got into all of these questions and more in this episode of Curiously. Ellen Damsky, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk to you because you have a very interesting background. You have worked in different fields, and you've been a real estate agent. You are one now. You've been a tour guide, a recruiter, a teacher. You're also a professional psychic and medium, and you also have a PhD in philosophy. And during your dissertation, the writing of your dissertation, you studied a very interesting place in northeastern New York, the sanatorium for tuberculosis that started in the late 1800s called the Trudeau Sanatorium. And your thesis was about this place and where people with TB, tuberculosis, went to heal and find what's called the fresh air cure up in the Adirondack Mountains in Saranac Lake, New York. So that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I read your thesis, all 2,785 pages of it. No, it was a great read.
Thank you.
And it came from your work as far as going to Saranac Lake and talking to former patients of the sanatorium and obviously doing research and pulling records and such. So I think that's where I really wanted to focus the conversation, to talk about the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium and particularly what drew you to the subject. How did you get involved in studying this?
Reluctantly. I mean, I'd like to say that it fascinated me from the beginning, but it didn't at all, actually. My father was living at Saranac Lake. He was retired at that point, although he never really retired. But he was very interested in the architecture and also very interested in the idea that there seemed to be this kind of air of optimism. I believe that's in the preface, which was true, that we would sit on the porch and muse. So he said, this would be a great dissertation topic. And I thought, okay, Dad, and there's a guy that you want me to meet too. It's like when anybody suggests a dissertation topic, it didn't grab me. But I had written actually my undergraduate thesis on AIDS. At that point, it was just called AIDS. So I had an interest in disease and containment and perceptions and all that. And as I was leaving town from visiting him, there was a little sign that said Saranac Lake celebrating 100 years of health. And I think I hit my brakes and said, 100 years of health? What about 100 years of rampant disease and dying? It just was like, wait a minute. There's something more here. So,
because the Trudeau Sanatorium lasted from what period of time? From
the official beginnings. And like any movement, there's a story that goes along with it. Some truth. I don't want to say some untruth, but, the origins of myth type of thing. So the official opening was 1884. There were 3 small cottages that were built by Dr. Trudeau, Little Red, Little Blue, and I think Little Green. Little Red was the one that became most associated. And I think that was because Trudeau himself lived there, actually, which why that became the focus. And then it ended in about 1954. Actually, there was a image of the baseball player leaving the sanatorium that was the cover of Life magazine in 1954. Pretty much almost immediately after drugs started to be used.
Antibiotics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There was no need for these sanatoriums anymore. The antibiotics essentially ended the sanatorium movement.
Pretty quickly. Literally, I would say almost overnight.
Right. So you were leaving town, and you had resisted the idea of writing about this and researching this, and something about the irony there kind of caught you, because like this was a place for however many decades was a place of people getting
dying.
a terrible disease, a protracted disease, and wasting away from it and not having a cure, and many didn't make it. And so what about that grabbed you?
Exactly what you said. I mean, I think irony is almost a good enough word. It was the rub, I guess. You know, the conversations that I had with my father about this air of optimism. You know, there it was on the sign, celebrating 100 years of health. You know, it's like, seriously? It just, I mean, I remember literally stopping in my tracks, as much as you can stop in your tracks when you're driving. But
You slammed on the brakes.
I slammed the brakes on,
Right. Well, it's not often people get a lightning bolt like that for a dissertation topic, so I understand that was an impactful moment.
Yeah, my father was really into the architecture, which, the porches certainly are interesting, but I wasn't anywhere near as interested in any of it as he was. And at that time, truthfully, I had no plans to do a PhD. So I think at that point I was thinking about a master's thesis. And I think he just thought that it was something interesting to write about, which he actually did, in fact, write about and publish before I finished my dissertation.
He scooped you.
He did totally scoop me.
Yeah.
So
classic dad.
Yeah, I know, right? There
So
I was.
you're in Saranac Lake. You see the sign that caught your eye. And so you parachute eventually into this subject and to do the work of, your degree wasn't in anthropology, but it is a very anthropological process that you followed, almost like an ethnographer. You know, you went to the library and you pulled records, and then you obviously did your own reading, and then you talked with patients who used to stay at the Trudeau Sanatorium who got well and look back on their experience. And part of, I think, what's really interesting about this topic is kind of how you titled your dissertation. You called it the fresh air cure, or a way of life, a fresh air cure, something like that. And, we can go wherever you want to go at this point, but like, I am very interested in like
how I got there.
The process. And,
actually, that wasn't the original title. I think you have the transcript, actually, where I underline a way of life. And that was the moment where it's like, okay, this is what it has to be called. When I originally started, I was more interested in the experience of space and place. But that was before I started interviewing people. And also I was interested in the architecture. I did want to write about something that I could actually prove existed. I could see the structure, especially after having written about AIDS, where even though I traced it, it was more ideological. And I wanted material proof. So my original idea was the idea of space. And again, that goes along with the optimism. When it changed and when it really, really took hold was when I started interviewing people. And the one interview that I would say that was the real changer, and I think it's okay if I mention her name, Grace Foyadelli. I don't think you've read her transcripts because I haven't found them yet. But at the point where I had interviewed her, she was probably late 70s, 80s. She was pretty small in stature. Her voice was pretty high octave because some of the treatments that she had gone under had damaged her vocal cords. She also had used this treatment that no doctor I've ever spoken to has ever heard of. It was called the Minaldi drain. And I don't know why I remember it, but what it sounded like was a giant vacuum cleaner for your lungs. So, and that was
what
right
could go wrong?
Yeah, I know, right? Except for, other organs, getting in the way. But at the point where I talked to her, she told me that Her son was only 2 years old when she was sent to the sanatorium. She lived there for 2 years. Her husband died within 5 years after. She asked if I wanted to see her ribs because she had had a surgery which they used to do. They cut the ribs at an angle, which, as you can imagine, didn't do great things for your body overall. But it was supposedly rested the lungs. Almost everything that they did in terms of the idea of the cure or surgery or whatever was to take pressure off the lungs in some way, shape, or form. So the thing that I learned from that was that if somebody asks you if you want to see the ribs, you say yes. And I said no. And it was a big mistake because it's important. It was obviously so important to her that she had kept them.
So it was living history, and you sound like you're more interested in space and place until you met a patient who was humanized the subject for you and brought it home and made it personal.
Well, I was always interested. I mean, my degree, even though it's in philosophy, I mean, I would consider myself a folklorist, an oral historian, ethnographer, the terms that you mentioned. And what happened during the interview with Mrs. Foyadelli, and this was not the first time that I had heard it, but it was the first time that, you know, her life was really interrupted in so many ways. And she said to me it was the best time of my life. And I remember, and I think this is a false memory, me grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her, which I don't think I really did, and saying, tell me how could it have been the best time of your life?
That's exactly what drew me to this conversation as
well.
well.
You were dying.
Right.
Your son was a baby. Your husband, you lost 2 years out of what was a very short marriage. And she was the catalyst that really put me on my quest to try to understand how the hell.
Fascinating.
Truthfully, people could remember those times as the best years of
So
their
I
life.
definitely want to get to that in a second, but I want to talk about sanatorium and sanatorium culture and the founder, because I think it's important, like, context for that patient. So a sanatorium is not a word we use a lot today. It's not a hospital because they don't deliver advanced medical treatment. There was no medical intervention or cure for people with TB at the Trudeau Sanatorium. You went there to, quote, chase the cure. And what you did is the founder, Edward Livingston Trudeau, his prescription, if you will, which worked for him in his own bout of TB, was the fresh air cure. It was to go to the Adirondack Mountains where the air was pure and fresh, and you would live this kind of outdoor life where you would rest, essentially, and you would focus on wholesome food, and you would be around other people with community. And that was kind of like this quasi-hospital, you know, and people came from all over the country, right?
Over the world.
Right. And Robert Louis Stevenson, the writer of Treasure Island, he spent time at the Trudeau Sanatorium. You talked with this patient who had been there, and she had experienced that, and she had gotten better. She had chased the cure and had been cured. So is there anything else to say about what a sanatorium is?
Well, at the time, it was not an uncommon term. And there were 3 sanatorium. It's spelled 3 different ways: sanatorium, sanitarium, and then
sanatoria, the plural, yeah.
Well, not even the plural, but where the I and the A go. And
san for short.
Yeah. Yeah, san is what a lot of them called it. But sanatorium with the 2 A's was actually at the time more associated with physical health. And sanitarium was more associated with mental health. So also, too, just in terms of historical context, a lot was happening at that time. And also the idea of mental health, too, and sanitarium was also on the rise at that time. In terms of Dr. Trudeau and the outdoor, Teddy Roosevelt was a big proponent, And before that, we were not an outdoorsy people, Americans. And, the Adirondack Mountains was the wilderness. And I think that term in today's context isn't even good enough. And we're talking about the wild, really emphasis on the wild part of wilderness. So when Trudeau went himself, and even though when you said it was successful, he died relatively young. He died, I believe he was 66 or 60. So tuberculosis ultimately killed him, He never used the word cure himself. He actually wrote an autobiography called Acquiescence, and that was the word that he used. And I was thinking about that word. And just even the word itself is kind of peaceful. It's a nice word. Where today we would say cancer is remission, which basically TB was in remission, not acquiesced.
Right. It never sort of got out of the body. It either took you or it became dormant.
Well, the thing with the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium, which was the original name, and then they shortened it to Trudeau, a little bit about him.
Yeah, let's talk about his story, where he came from.
He was French, actually. I wish I knew more, but nobody that I spoke to was alive knew him because he had died in 1915. So he was French. It's a bit of a mystery to me to this day how he managed to do what he did to build basically somewhat of an empire in the wilderness, which I would imagine cost a little bit of money. I don't want to say he was a ne'er-do-well because it wasn't that, but medicine at the time historically was kind of the last stop. You can't do anything else. You might as well be a doctor. It cost $5, I think, for him to be admitted. His own narrative was that he had a brother that died of TB and that was what inspired him. And he was sick himself. And apparently he had spent some time in the Adirondacks and loved it and had a guide because you had to because, again, it was the wilderness. It's not just taking you like we would think of a guide these days. It takes you to the good parts. The guides were necessary to show you how to live within an environment with which you're completely unfamiliar. So he went to the wilderness one last time before he died and found he was better.
And so he has this incredible origin story for, the fresh air cure.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually some of it, I don't want to say it's false because it's not, but like I said before.
Yeah.
Well, when I looked up the records, because the story is that two girls came from New York City, it's important to know that the original idea of the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium at that time was to offer the cure for the working class. And although that changed, it didn't change over time in terms of the sanatorium itself, but the culture of Saranac Lake attracted a lot of moneyed and wealthy and famous and all that. Oh, and by the way, Robert Louis Stevenson, he lived separately. Apparently he and Trudeau really clashed, or Stevenson clashed with some of the other members. There's been some stories about that. And he ultimately just went to the islands and died. So,
right, because he had a house. He still has a house at the historical site. You can
go
there and tour it. And then, he eventually went to warmer climates to try to...
Which, some will say that's what did him in. He should have stayed in the Adirondacks. The Adirondacks is not known for being warm and balmy.
Well, it's 1,500 feet high in altitude. And, the winters are brutal.
Well, my father always said that by the time you felt cold, it was too late, because it's more of a dry cold. And also the idea of going anywhere climate-wise for a variety of diseases that were curable or incurable. Remember, this is before science in some ways. I know that sounds a little unbelievable because 1800s wasn't that long ago. So it wasn't the first time or the first idea that you go someplace for climate. For instance, a lot of the people that went west for gold were also TB people. So Trudeau wanted to make the experience that he had accessible to the working class. So that was how it was founded. And then what happened is that all of Saranac Lake became basically revolved around the sanatorium. People might have lived in what became known as cure cottages off of the grounds. And the grounds, I think you've been there, they still exist. I believe now it's owned by the American Medical Association. But I think they've kept all the buildings and haven't torn them down. But
I think that you mentioned that 1 out of 3 people around that time in Saranac Lake was in some way associated with the tuberculosis treatment. So it was a cottage industry. The whole place was. So the sign makes sense in a way that you saw at the beginning. It's 100 years of health, but it was 100 years of treating a terrible disease as well.
Well, when I first started my research, when I went to, I think it was my first trip to do some of the field work, a woman by the name of Mary Hotelling, she's probably the premier expert on all things Saranac Lake and Trudeau. She sat me down and said, you need to know most of the people died. She said, so it's going to be tough.
This isn't a happy story in a way. Yeah.
It is and it isn't. I mean, but the stories that I heard from the people,
The survivors, essentially, the people who
I never heard that word from
not
them.
survivor. No, yeah.
But that was
successful.
also more before that term wasn't as much part of the vernacular.
It's a fascinating contradiction that like most people who went there did not survive, and yet the people who did look back on the time quite fondly as a time that wasn't just chasing the cure.
Well, more than fondly. I mean, some stayed there. Also, too, the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium, this is important, did not take people that were in advanced stages of TB.
Right.
You know, and I don't want to get necessarily too graphic about it, but so their chances not only to get better, but also to experiment with. And again, I want to be careful here because it wasn't like they were doing all these terrible experiments. But, you know, I mentioned before the Minaldi drain and, you know, so there was definitely some, let's give this a shot, you know, and more formal. You know, they were all doctors, obviously, and there's an institute, the Trudeau Institute, that researches infectious diseases. So it was actively progressive, I would say.
Sure. I mean, even in the COVID pandemic, there's a period of an explosion of treatment possibilities. You know, what works, what doesn't work, and I'm sure
particularly when you're in the middle of it. Although TB has been around for a long time, but you know, and a funny thing is that a lot of people asked me then, and it's been a number of years since I wrote this, that do I think that this could happen again? And then, you know, since that time we've had the pandemic. At that point, I said, I don't think so. And I think that that's been borne out by the experience of the pandemic.
And so just to circle back again on Trudeau's story, right? So his brother dies of TB, he gets TB, goes to the Adirondacks, gets better. So walk me through like the founding of his sanatorium, because he's known as the founder of the sanatorium movement. That
is a little bit of a mystery. I mean, obviously it took money, and it's actually something else my father and I used to talk about, because we think it's been written that one of the founders was, or benefactors, Harriman, the railroad guy, who apparently was not known for generosity. But I imagine Trudeau must have been an incredibly charismatic person. I actually have thought sometimes if I were to write this again, I would write it as basically an evangelical movement. I think it has a lot of the hallmarks of that.
How so?
Well, there was a deep belief in the cure and the founder of the cure, which I wouldn't call it a cult, but a lot of it had to do with the people that were leading you through the darkness. I don't need to sound all melodramatic over here, but a lot of the nurses and doctors had TB themselves. I mean, it was pretty contagious. Right. So it was, you know, unfortunately bound to happen. But I think for him to have established the relationships that he had with the patients, with the other doctors, for him to have built a community, which is really what he did, of people that were dying, and to be able to make them feel and be as cared for as they were, to form a philosophy that sustained them, in many cases, I would say, for 60 or 70 years. I mean, a lot of these people that I interviewed were in their early 20s, if not younger, when I interviewed them. And it opened in 1884 and closed in 1954. So that time alone, the roots were deep.
And so what is it about this guy? You know, there's the charisma, there's the leadership, but it's the ideology, it's the optimism.
I guess. I mean, that I'll never know. There was one person that I was hoping would have maybe met him, and she hadn't, because she was in her late 90s and somebody else had suggested that she may have known him. She did know one of his sons ended up taking over, becoming a doctor, and she did know him, and, you know, felt that they were family. But, you know, even family obviously can be a contested term in terms of ideology and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, right place, right time.
But it's hope, right? You know, if you are in the advanced stages of the disease and you've exhausted your options, you chase the cure. You go to this place and you meet other people in the same situations. Your healthcare providers have had the disease themselves, so there's a level of empathy and compassion that they can bring to the care. And you feel maybe that this is a place of hope. This is a place where the psychological aspects of healing can be activated.
Well, in some cases, they got sent there. which is another thing that probably would never happen today. Their employer sent them. And also, there was not a private sanatorium close by called Raybrook, state-owned, which was a very different experience. And one thing that I came to conclude by the time I finished, and I know we're trying to start at the beginning here, was that, we've all been part of a group, that we can say you have to be part of that group to understand.
Solidarity that comes with it.
Yeah. And, and that's why you had asked me at some point about my use of books that talked about war. It's often talked about in very similar ways, that you've survived a battle of sorts.
Tim O'Brien's Things They Carried.
Yeah.
You reference that in your dissertation.
I mean, I've not been in war. I've not been in a sanatorium. Can I understand that this camaraderie developed or this hope? Yes, but it's still, to this day, it's like the best days of your life.
Well, the thing that strikes me is if you think about these cure cottages, you think about the porch, the wraparound porch, where patients would be brought out during the day to sit in the sitting cots, I think it was, and you had blankets on you, and you developed real friendships. And you also developed romantic relationships. A lot of these patients coupled up, married later. Like, I just see that picture in my mind of a dozen people sitting on the porch together. And you're sick, you're fatigued, you don't feel well. In some cases, you're on death's doorstep, but at least you have friends, at least you have camaraderie, at least you have people you like and you can hang out with, and they're all going through the same exact thing as you're going through.
But that's also assuming that you're choosing your porch mates. And also in the cottages, the porches were small, might only have held one or two people. And as I mentioned, at some point, there was some interesting blends of people, which is in some ways may have been a benefit, because you did encounter people that you there were gangsters. There were all sorts of people that were on this porch from 1 to 3, I believe.
Disease doesn't discriminate,
No, but the porches could have.
Got it. So, meaning some people went out, some people didn't, or, yeah.
I mean, as far as like sharing your time, ideally you would like to be able to do that, the people that you want to hang out with all day. But remember, we're talking day after day after day, and sometimes for years. And the idea of the cure porch, which is different from the wraparound porch, is that you were out there as long as you could be. Some people talk about waking up and with snow on their beds. And so it's an extended period of time that you're not necessarily moving around. You're confined to your bed. In town, they're all known as cottages in Saranac Lake. They were called up cottages, which meant you could move around or down. The people that tended to be cared for in the houses in town tended to be sicker. So at the same time, again, we remember it as, oh, I loved my porch mate, when, certainly, why wouldn't there be some challenges? I'm not even necessarily saying bad neighbor challenges, but
Sure.
But just challenges. You're spending a lot of time around people under what they consider to be ideal circumstances.
I think about the term like trauma bonding, but I think the war analogy is an interesting one. Sebastian Junger, a nonfiction writer, wrote a book called Tribe, and he talked about this, the bonds that soldiers create with each other when they're in these very life-threatening circumstances that last their entire lives. It's almost, at a sanatorium, I could see a similar dynamic happening.
But I think it was more than that. I think it was more than a tribe. I think it really changed the way people saw life. Oh. Pretty much everybody that I talked to, I'm tempted to say everybody, had gone on to live very rich lives, very engaged, and still 70 years later would say it was the best time, which I think part of that had to do with, their meals were given to them.
The structured and regimented
Which
day.
A lot of people said, they said we didn't have to worry about anything.
You don't.
Except for dying, and when I brought that up at certain points.
You only have to worry about healing.
That's your main.
Focus on your health.
On your health, which is, you're not, I don't even know about focus, because you're acquiescent. So, and one person said, I think it was in the transcripts, I believe it was Mrs. Wareham, said, we never thought about dying. And a lot of the people were young. So at 19, you don't necessarily think about it, although evidence would suggest otherwise.
So you go through this for the patients you spoke to who had reached a period of acquiescence. They You said they live rich. Most of them live these rich lives now, and I think there's something almost cliche there about, going to face your own mortality, right? And then
but they never really talked about that. That was what was interesting to me, was they didn't say I was looking at death and I had to live the best life. It wasn't that kind of dichotomy. It wasn't that I had a near-death experience, so now I have to live life to every moment. And also some of the habits, although I would say that became more of a philosophy of life, was every one of them sleeps with the window open.
to this day, like throughout their life.
Yep.
To
Hotel
circulate the
rooms,
air.
not good because you can't open the window. Always slept with remember, at that time, too, the late 1800s, although I didn't interview people, obviously, that went that far back, the idea of night air was bad. It was the Romantic poets that kind of brought that to us. For some reason, I keep thinking about Mary Poppins. The scene. Have you seen Mary Poppins? The original?
No.
Well, when you go home and watch it,
Right.
the scene with Dick Van Dyke and people make fun of me because apparently I say this word incorrectly, chimney. But I think in Mary Poppins they say chimney. There's a scene where Dick Van Dyke and his fellow chimney sweeps are singing on top of the rooftops. And the idea that the air is dirty, and it's night air. It's not day air. So there was a sense, too, that, the wilderness is a dangerous place. But the cities that was where TB really, got its foothold. And unfortunately, too, some of the idea that the working class and immigrants, obviously, too, at the time, it was a time of heavy immigration. So it's these bad people that bring disease. And that was something Trudeau really rallied against.
And what else was Trudeau doing at the sanatorium during this time? He's a doctor himself, so he's treating patients.
Yeah.
He's raising money.
He was doing research, too.
He's doing research
Yeah.
on the disease.
Mm-hmm. And he himself was not well.
So he was in this protracted disease state. So did he suffer from fatigue if he overworked himself? Or?
Yeah, I don't think he was functioning yet. And also, too, he had a daughter that died of TB. His daughter.
Right, his brother and daughter.
Yeah. And his son, he had a son who apparently was his favorite, died apparently not of tuberculosis, of something else. So surviving son went on. And also, too, just out of pop culture interest, he was Gary Trudeau, the cartoonist, Doonesbury great-grandfather. And I actually wrote to Gary Trudeau at one point. And I did it later than I would have if he hadn't been Gary Trudeau, because I didn't want him to think just because he was famous I was writing to him. And I told him if you weren't famous, you probably would have heard from me a lot sooner. But I was curious about if anybody knew anything more. The best and worst thing in my mind that Trudeau did was write an autobiography, because what happened was a lot of the research referred back to the autobiography. And I think you always have to question what people, including myself, say about themselves. Going back to the myth of origin. When I dug into the medical records, as I was saying before, the idea was that these two women lived in Little Red. Why they chose that, I think, was because Trudeau himself had lived there for a while. Supposedly both sisters had TB. And the idea of two young women going into the wilderness by themselves. I mean, you have the idea of the cult of sisterhood at that time. But when I looked into the medical records, I saw no evidence that one of the sisters had tuberculosis. And at that time, they could see it, the bacilli.
Are there scholars or even journalists, are they going back and double checking the facts of the time with Trudeau's conceptualization of himself and his autobiography? Because I imagine there's a lot of fabrication. I mean, to some degree, he was an imaginative person, and I could see him fudging some things in his own story.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there was a very definite idea and a perception and persona to some degree, although if that were the case, I would feel more comfortable saying I know what kind of person he was, and I don't. But that's what I meant about saying that one of the worst things he could have done was we do rely on some of the ideas of what he had in his autobiography. And I don't know what other research did and didn't do. One of the interesting things about doing the oral histories was going into people's houses almost everybody had every single one of the books that had ever been written about Saranac Lake, and they all had very definite ideas, about the person that wrote them and about the perceptions or whatever. Trudeau, I would say himself and his autobiography were pretty untouchable. So that's why I was so shocked. I think it's in my notes somewhere in big letters with exclamation points. Like, I think their sister's name was Mary and Alice Hunt, and that one of them, at least in what I'm seeing, didn't have tuberculosis. But at that time, not only to send a young woman by herself into the woods wasn't something that would be done. Also, Alice and Mary were not the first ones there at the cottages that he built, but they became the narrative. And I think they were sent home, and pretty much nothing more could be done. Also, one thing, too, as far as the optimism, when somebody did die, they were very careful about how that was handled. Like the corpses, people were taken out of town at night. And also, one thing I remember about one of the times when I visited my father was he was a walker, and he liked to walk to the cemetery. And I think one of the things that got him really interested was apparently there was a ship of Norwegian sailors that landed in Saranac Lake and died there. And they're all buried in the cemetery. So this idea that, sometimes people sort of arrived at the shores accidentally and became literally an integral part of this culture eternally, he found really interesting.
In some ways, a sanatorium maybe exists because there isn't an effective treatment. It's not quite hospice, but it's something below hospice. So it's like, what I'm getting at is that when antibiotics come on the scene, it was an effective way of treating TB. So that, as I understand by reading your work, was like effectively the end of the sanatorium movement, at least in regards to TB. So how did that happen? What was that transition of all of a sudden we have antibiotics and there's no need for the Trudeau Sanatorium? What was that transition like?
I think it was literally almost overnight. And it wasn't just a Trudeau Sanatorium, it was across the country. Also, the sanatoriums, too, could be designated and divided. TB isn't just a disease of the lung. It's the one that we know most of. But, children would get what was called Pott's disease. It actually had a specific name. And it usually affected the spine. So, used to be, I would say, not so much anymore, that we'd see somebody who looked like they, it had a spinal situation. They probably had TB as a child. So it really destroyed the economy of Saranac Lake. And, I would say to a large degree, and you've been there recently, I haven't, it really never recovered. And that was the sense from inside Saranac Lake.
It's a sleepy town. It's
looks kind of off the beaten path. But
for sure, yeah.
But, it's also only 10 miles away from Lake Placid, which is, the Olympics have been there twice. And
it overshadows this.
Yeah. So, the AMA, I believe, uses it for retreats and things like that, which means you're going there for something special. It's kind of, again, off the beaten path. But it did have a huge economic impact on the city of Saranac Lake when it closed.
Did it shut down, essentially?
Well, another interesting thing that happens with the buildings, that the sanatoriums, and this is true of Trudeau in many places, is that they became something else. But there was this prevailing idea that disease actually gets into the walls. So often structures were burnt down, or torn down, or turned into something that was sort of lateral, like a prison. Wow. And I mean, I've been into other buildings that used to be sanatoriums and have become something else. And, you can often tell the way that the physical structure is set up, low sinks and a lot of times doorways. And this is one way you can look at a cure cottage, is that sometimes the width of the doorway is about the same width of the beds that roll in and out.
Right, they're quite wide.
Yeah, but the introduction of drugs was the end of the sanatorium movement. And to some degree, the end of Saranac Lake life as it was known during that time.
I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about is sort of the biology of the disease. And I know you're not a biologist, but I guess one of the things I found in researching is that, I obviously knew about TB globally and how it affected people, but I didn't understand the scope of the public health problem. Apparently in 2020, 1.5 million people lost their lives to TB. And, it's treatable. It's curable. We have antibiotics, but in developing countries, it infects more than 10 million people a year. And a lot of that has to do with people who can't access care or they don't have time to complete lengthy treatment. We've talked about acquiescence. But when you talk to patients, what was their subjective experience of the disease? What did they feel like? What was happening to them?
Yeah, I would say the most poignant example of that was Mrs. Foyadelli. Mm-hmm. When you have TB, it's hard to eat, because digestion and just the act of eating requires oxygen, which when you have a disease of the lung is challenged. And she told me about a time where I think her husband had come to visit, took her out for a steak dinner. And the Trudeau Sanatorium served up a pretty nice menu, and desserts and very rich food. The idea was that you had to maintain a certain weight. Actually, a lot of times if you were allowed off the campus of the sanatorium, you had to weigh a certain amount. But she talked about looking at the steak and not being able to eat it. And people, come on, eat. And I think, she just cried and just said, I just can't.
Not because she was nauseous, but because she physically couldn't.
Physically couldn't, which I think we've all had, unfortunately, I think a point where it's like, no matter how much you want that steak, you just can't do it. But this was the physical inability. People with lung disease don't often tend to be overweight. You can't get the air out either, not just be able to take it in, but you also can't expel it.
It's like labored breathing is the experience.
Yeah. Well, and also, too, that goes back to, one of the inventions, the Adirondack chair, which is still around today, that it was designed by a doctor. A lot of people don't know this. And, I think one of the reasons it survived is because even as hard as the wood is, it's very comfortable, the position of the body. It kind of takes the weight off the lungs. But
so that's what it is. If you think about an Adirondack chair and you fold yourself into it.
The Adirondack chair was designed, developed, and invented at the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium.
Specifically for people with this
TB.
lung disease, yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
Huh.
Actually, a lot of times that was what they were in a lot of the time because, they came up and down. They were chairs and beds, although they also had real beds. But going back to the etiology of the disease, TB has been around forever. I mean, it's phthisis. It was one of the Greek term. I mean, it's been around for thousands
all
of
ancient
years.
cultures have stories of China, Egypt.
It's been around a long time. I think it was attributed to killing more people during World War I than combat, which is often true, unfortunately, of war, that disease plays a large role as well. And it does, like many diseases, kind of cycle, sort of like the pandemic. It's been the last big pandemic was the flu epidemic in 1915. So with all due respect, we were our number was up for another one. Mm-hmm. And, scientists have always been challenged to explain why it suddenly comes up and then why it stops. Kind of like, I think we all remember March 16th. And then just this week, I think, it's like, okay, the pandemic as we know it, I think it's safe to say, is ended. Mm-hmm. And there was a hope that the doctor, his name is spelled Koch, Dr. Koch or Dr. Koch, however you pronounce it. He was the one that identified the tuberculosis. And that was after, germ theory. Virchow had, it's not invented germ theory, but...
just created that framework.
Yeah, actually there's a really great story about Virchow being in the room.
Have at it.
Yeah, I love that. One of my favorite moments. When I always called him Koch. When Koch announced the tuberculosis at a conference, where often these things, the scientific conferences, are the place to be if you want to know what's happening.
And if you're ahead of the game, everyone heckles you and walks out of the room.
Well, he did. That's literally, Virchow got up and walked out. And then the hope of Koch was that he was then going to be able to find a cure. Because once you know the cause, the cure,
it was
what's
the first
next?
Thing we did with COVID. We had to understand the genetics of it.
Yeah, and then get rid of it. But he was never able to do it, which was unfortunate. He tried. There were a couple false starts, and some excitement that he was going to. And then, these days, it does make sense, obviously, developing countries. TB is both infectious and contagious. It can spread relatively easily. Some populations, like any disease, have natural immunity, which might mean that they're immune to TB because they get something else. And I want to say I hate to say crapshoot, but, like COVID, we all know somebody whose wife got it and the husband didn't. So why did one person get it and the other not? So we do at the same time have the science and then a little bit of the mystery. A cure takes hold, but then you find that you've got to double it up with something else.
Because of the infinitely creative capacity of microorganisms
Absolutely.
to co-evolve with our
Yep.
own weapons.
Yeah.
And now we have multi-resistant tuberculosis.
We had multi-resistant drug tuberculosis from the beginning, I think. I always felt that because it wasn't just streptomycin. They were doubling up and, mixing drugs even.
They were
from the
throwing
beginning.
everything at it, right?
Yeah. Well, and then things worked and didn't work. And, and when you're in a prison kind of a situation, at one and the same time, you have a population that's stable and stationary, but then evolving. So you have people coming in not only as inmates, but as visitors. But then you have sort of this low-level platform of disease, if that makes sense. Well, there's a term, actually, hospitalism, that some of us that are a little bit older, whose parents and grandparents really resisted going to hospitals because they'd say, I'm going to die there. Well, that was a valid fear because hospitals were, before drugs, where they would cut off limbs and things like that because they couldn't control infection or gangrene. You were going to die there.
You'd catch something.
Yeah. I mean, there was a couple sayings. The treatment was successful, but the patient died because the amputation worked, but the patient didn't survive. I mean, women used to die a lot from what was called puerperal fever, which is an infection that comes in after childbirth. And hospitalism was a term that was associated with, you go to the hospital and you're going to die there. But why wouldn't infection be more rampant in a hospital when you have so many possibilities? Let me put
There
it
was
that
a
way.
bank robber who asked, why do you rob banks? He said that's where the money is.
Right.
And so in a
Exactly.
way, that's where the disease is.
Sure.
It's in a
Yeah.
hospital.
I mean, a cousin of mine died of COVID that he got in the hospital, contracted in the hospital. So, yeah, there was that.
Yeah. Stop me if you don't want to talk about this, totally. But Lyme disease.
Yeah, that did definitely play a part.
So you and again, stop me right now, but like if you don't want to get into it, but personally you were affected by Lyme.
I had it I think if I hadn't had it, I don't know that I would have written this dissertation.
That's kind of what I was wondering. So Trudeau has a brother who passes from TB and a daughter eventually. He had it himself. And isn't that a common theme? A quest can be born from your personal experience with something. So I'm not sure that Trudeau would have,
absolutely.
had he not go to the Adirondacks to get better, I don't think he would have started. So how did your experience?
Well, actually, when I was writing about AIDS, I was really sick with Lyme disease. And this was in 1989. And we're really just beginning to hear about the experience of Lyme disease. And we're talking, 30? You do the math. It's been a while. And people like Amy Tan, and I'm fine with talking about it because I think we need people to understand more about it. I always felt that Lyme disease was ill-timed. It came up at the same time as a lot of these sort of mysterious autoimmunes. And that also, unfortunately, were associated with women, like chronic fatigue, like women get tired and, know. And Lyme disease isn't contagious. It's infectious. You can't get it other than a blood transfusion maybe or a tick.
And you got it from a tick bite.
Yeah.
And did you have a rash?
I did, which is a huge misnomer. A rash is characteristic of a tick bite. But I had the unusual pleasure, and it was in a lot of ways, actually, weirdly, of being treated in a group of people because where I was living at the time, Lyme disease was a hotbed, literally. I had a
Places
really...
like Nantucket, yeah?
Yeah, I was in upstate in New York.
Okay.
But I had a really great doctor. I didn't experience what a lot of people did. Nobody told me I was crazy or anything like that. And actually, I was working at a health center. And the joke was I was the sickest person there, but they generously kept me on even though I had very little brain function.
You had chronic
Lyme.
I
got late stage. By the time they figured it out, it was already crossed over the blood-brain barrier. So as far as like relativity of experience, at that time they didn't believe Lyme disease was fatal, although I would have begged to differ. I felt like
you got hit by a truck. You felt like you maybe was going to die from
well,
this.
I felt like I was going to die. And actually, when I was writing about AIDS, a dear friend of mine did. So, and I felt very committed to, if I was going to do any of this kind of work, it had to serve a purpose. I didn't want it sitting on a shelf like most dissertations and theses do and collect dust.
Totally. Yeah. So there was a personal aspect to this.
Yeah, it was ironic in a lot of ways because, you're writing about something that's not happening to you, but yet it's happening to you. I mean, I remember at one point sitting and typing. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but before I...
Now we just have AI, right? Whatever we need
I know, right? I don't even have to do anything anymore. But I'm sitting and I had to do the intravenous therapy, which it was 30 days every single day.
Wow.
Yeah, mine was from Thanksgiving till New Year's Eve day.
Merry Christmas.
No, it just blew right over that one. I think my doctor let me have champagne on. So they go up your arm, and the drugs that they use aren't necessarily friendly. And I was a bit of a guinea pig because they basically paid for it. And I knew they were experimenting, you can tell. So you kind of end up pretty much a mess. And I had people run away from me because this was early in the days of Lyme disease.
There was a stigma.
Yeah. And people were like, why is your hand wrapped up? Because I kept it wrapped up because it was ugly. And I'd say, well, I have Lyme disease. And they would run. But I felt like I had an obligation to educate people, that you're not going to catch it. This is what it is. This is how it's contracted. Oh, but when you said about the rash, I'm sorry. It was what happened with me, which was really kind of ironic, was most of the people that I was treated with, and there was probably about 20 or 30 of us that kind of were rotating. And we were all in a room hooked up to our machines and singing songs and all sorts of...
A little bit like a cure
It was.
porch,
It was. It was actually kind of great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I have said myself, getting Lyme disease was one of the best experiences.
And there we go.
Yeah. But physically, I don't mean that necessarily.
No, because it was brutal and you felt like you were going to die.
Well, and you learn, for me, I never heard this, let me say it like that, from the TB people. I learned what my limitations weren't. For instance, one thing that you don't hear much about Lyme disease is it can be incredibly painful. Mine settled in my spine, actually. I had a back injury at one point. And to me, it made sense. Why wouldn't it go where the welcome sign is already out?
Come on in, the water's warm.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that was one thing that sort of took longer to diagnose because at that point, that wasn't one of the symptoms. And I was intermittently paralyzed, actually. And the symptoms can land and go very, very quickly.
Right. Just like COVID, it affects multiple body systems. Like
I always said it affects everything.
Right.
But my hair. I had some good hair days, but everything else, pretty much everything else was up for grabs.
Wow.
But at the same time, having said that, it was not the best time of my life.
And that's what's common here, right? Is that the actual experience of disease is not a time of romanticism. This is a time of getting through it. But then it's on the other side of it, the kind of post-traumatic recovery is, I think, what we're...
I don't know. I mean, because I heard people saying it exactly, which is one of the things that I look for as a folklorist, is patterns. And sometimes that means literally, I want to see that somebody said the same sentence over and over and over again.
Right.
And when they said over and over and over again, it is the best time of my life. I mean, I said it was a good experience in a lot of times, but it wasn't the best experience, and certainly not the best experience of my life. So that was when I came to the conclusion, ultimately, that as good research as I may have done, or as great interviews that I had, and they were amazing, absolutely, do I understand how they can look back and remember it as the best time of their life, particularly when we're talking people that went on to live, as I said before, very rich lives? I would say it's something that really still kind of baffles me.
Really? Because there are possible explanations, which we've talked about. It's a sense of community, the solidarity, the fact that life was structured and regimented.
But they never really said...
They didn't use those words.
No, that's what... I can't remember anybody saying,
I found my tribe or something.
Yeah, or my lifelong friend. We were in the sanatorium. I mean, and I never really thought about it like this, but even the interviews were kind of solitary. And I think what I mean by that is that when you do field work, you're usually doing it with a focus. So there is a communal and a community aspect of people in a group that there's some underlying commonality. And obviously there was in this case, but I don't remember anybody ever mentioning anybody by name. I mean, there was a couple that met there, and cousining people did. That was the term that was used for
idea of basically hooking up at the sanatorium.
Yeah,
right.
and that I forgot exactly that there was a state line that once you cross, that you were no longer married, and
Oh, interesting. Well, after you get out of the kind of the ecosystem.
The rules. Yeah. And actually, one of the most fun parts for me of the whole process was all the stories that people told me about getting around the rules, as much as they lived by them and swore by them.
There's such a summer camp thing
totally.
going on here.
Well, they were young. They were sneaking into bars
That's
at night.
right. I guess if you're in your 20s, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the toilet bowls, that's where you kept your liquor to keep it cold. I mean, there was taxi drivers that, meet me at 12, that, by the back door.
Well, we all look back on summer camp and we say, man, that was a hoot. That was a great time, and because you did stuff like that, you messed around and you got into stuff. And so it sounds like we're getting it still at why it was the best time of your life.
Yeah, and that actually, I think you hit on something there because, and if you look at a lot of the pictures, you do see images of people laying in bed. You don't see them 5 minutes before.
Exactly right. You don't see the disease state. You don't.
No.
You see the disease and how it affects the body.
Actually, there was one saying that was you could tell who had TB in Saranac Lake because they were the ones that looked healthy. And a lot of times you'll see people in these pictures that they're outdoors and they're the picture of health.
That's the untold story. I think you should do that next, which is that let's forget about those images of people lying in bed. And let's try to dig up pictures of them at bars and them skirting the rules and having fun.
Actually,
I mean, that's kind of interesting.
Well, there was one woman that I interviewed. This was the one I mentioned to you earlier. It was a 7-hour interview.
7 hours.
And I'm leaving 7 hours later. And I see this picture on her wall. And it's Mark Twain in a bar. And I said, is that Mark Twain? And she, oh, yeah, this house used to be a speakeasy. I was like, and also, 1920s was the heyday of the sanatorium movement, and everybody, including them, was roaring. They were not necessarily not partaking in not only life, but what was happening in the rest of the world, and they were very close to Canada. So, you had very organized crime, liquor.
And as you said, there were literal gangsters there.
Yeah, they were. Gangsters got TB.
It discriminated. So
it didn't discriminate. But one thing I've always said is that people there had the opportunity to maybe die in more comfortable circumstances.
Right.
I mean, you don't necessarily die better. I would imagine TB is a pretty awful way to die. I don't think that there was necessarily anything anybody could do at that time. And I don't know if they were using drugs then, morphine and things like that. But you were possibly more comfortable.
Well, if I had TB and I was about to die, I would certainly want my caregivers to know what that's like. There's a level of compassion that they would bring to it. So I can imagine that those final days would be more comfortable because you were literally surrounded by people who knew exactly what you were going through.
And with all due respect, but physically, it's got to be a terrible way to die.
Because
so I'm not sure that I...
Yeah.
It'd
There's
be
no
nice
way to
if you were
romanticize
patting
this.
my head and telling me to go to the light. But what I might really want is just give me the drugs because this is hell right now. So
absolutely,
I'm not sure that at the end of life, I know compassion obviously matters, but I think physical comfort too is probably way up there.
So, we've got a few minutes left. How do we zoom out here? How do we broaden the conversation? We've talked about COVID, how this relates to COVID. What insights do we draw from,
Well, I would say with the American fear of death and the process of death and dying, even though I think that it has changed somewhat, with hospice or whatever, I think one of the interesting, satisfying reasons for studying this, and something I've learned through this passage, is that, when you get that close, I want to say you get to the good stuff. And I don't mean that tritely at all. I mean that with reverence and respect for people, for life itself. But I think when we avoid the hard stuff, we miss the possibility of somebody saying at 80 years old that when I was 19 and dying, or the person next to me, was the best time of my life.
Because it cuts through, doesn't it?
It cuts through a lot of stupid stuff.
Right. The trivialities, the grievances, the daily routines.
Fights with the neighbors,
We know a lot about that.
Yeah. And cutting through that gets you to the good stuff.
And the good stuff is what?
Oh, gosh. Is that you're asking me? You just asked me what the meaning of life is, I think, is what you asked.
You have 6
The meaning
minutes.
of life is whatever it is that you find when you get there. And I think that that's what's cool about life. How does that sound for an academic? Mm-hmm. The cool thing about life is that what you take from it, what you give to other people, what you share is what really life is all about. I would like to say for a well-lived life. Like I just read something in the paper today about somebody in the area that died. And the headline was, I think it was the Boston Globe, where it said, it's worth it to be nice to people, other people. And that apparently at this person's funeral, who had achieved quite a bit professionally, but what came out was that he was kind, you know?
Because kindness, there isn't just an ethical component in terms of societal outcomes. It actually has its own benefits to the self. The Greeks talked about virtue, living a virtuous life, is the way to a happy life, the way to eudaimonia, I think it is, the flourishing life. It's its own reward.
Actually, there's the statue of Trudeau at the Trudeau Sanatorium was done by, I'm going to skip his name because I'll mispronounce it, the same one that did Mount Rushmore. I mean, that's the stature that Trudeau had. And I'd like to suggest that it might not have been that he was the best doctor.
Right.
But I think it was because he was the best loved doctor. And I think that certainly at this point in time, you know, in the age of science and AI, his scientific contributions to some degree don't matter anymore. But what he did does matter.
You know, there's a corollary here, and I don't only think about it right now, but it's Paul Farmer, the Brigham and Women's public health expert who treated TB. He passed away a few years ago, and he was beloved. He was beloved around the world for his compassionate care, for his humanitarian work, for just going into places like Haiti and starting a community health center and actually getting into the logistical problems of how do you get people from their, you know, distant villages into the hospital. And there was some corollary between Farmer and Trudeau here. It's this kind of...
Yeah, and I think there are some people, and I've met them, and it's one of those characteristics that it's really hard to get a handle on. But I remember one doctor that he just had forgive the use of this very unscientific word, but an aura about him that you just walked in the door. It's like, oh, thank God. You know, so it takes a lot to be a quote unquote good healer. You know, you can be, well, what's that TV show where, you know, the good doctor? You know, you can be a good doctor and have a lousy bedside manner. Or have a lousy, or, you know, and there's infinite varieties of that.
Yeah,
so.
I think...
and I think each experience, I mean, TB, the experience of TB at that time is a unique experience in and of that time.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think Trudeau, it was part scientist, part doctor, part faith healer. And that ability...
That's what I said about the evangelical.
Yeah, there was a religious...
I think there was a very deep religious, that you had to really believe, you believed.
And of course we know from the placebo effect and just the power of believing in your healthcare provider, yeah.
But did that really save lives? I mean, then there's that.
Well, it activates...
Well, I've had a lot of doctors ask me, because I've interviewed a lot of doctors through this process, almost every single one of them has said, so what do you think? It's like, well, you're the doctor, you know, did the cure work? Like, and if it did... What made it work? Was it the fresh air? Was it the good food? Was it the rest? Was it the...
It's the multifactorial. And yeah, of course, lowering your fight or flight responses, being in a less stressed state. But there's something to be said. There's a lot to be said, actually, about belief in one's outcome and whether or not the healthcare provider can activate that belief.
I know. The only hesitation I have about that is the idea that then we are responsible or not responsible. You know,
Totally.
You can have a really good attitude and not survive
I think
and a lousy attitude and do,
I agree. And there's a place for traditional
Actually,
alternative.
I have a conversation with a doctor about that. When I was being treated for Lyme disease, I actually stayed in school, which I regret I mean, to some degree, I think I might have gotten better faster if I, not been going to classes, although. And, pretty much everybody else I was treated with were on leaves. And there was one man that came in every day with a suit going to work. And then one day he wasn't in the suit anymore. And nobody said anything, but we knew it meant he just couldn't work anymore. But I said to my doctor one day, because he said, I told somebody that we have somebody that's still going to school. And I said, don't do that to me or them, because it's setting up this false model. And truthfully, I don't think it was the best thing for me to do. So.
Well, we have to wrap up.
Well, thank you. This was very interesting.
This was a great conversation. Just very briefly, where can people find your thesis if they want to read it?
Actually, it's online now. Go to Binghamton, put my name, Ellen Damsky,
Okay.
you square at the sky without the N. It's how you spell my last name.
Yeah, all right.
And Binghamton, it's
The Way of Life.
a way,
Yeah.
a way of life. The Fresh Air Cure in Binghamton. It'll pop up.
And I'll put a link to it. But, well, thanks for sharing insights from your work.
Yeah,
it's
thank you.
fascinating, and it has a lot to say about today. And I hope people take something from our conversation.
Yeah,
So,
thank you. I hope so.
all right.
And thank you, Dustin, for your interest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Curiously. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ellen Damsky. Stay tuned for more conversations with people I meet along the way.